The baby was already underwater when Choi Tae-yoon jumped in. No hesitation, no calculation, just the sight of a blue bundle tumbling off the edge of the Hangang Bridge in the rain. And every instinct he'd buried under 15 years of blood and empire exploded back to the surface. He hit the water like a blade, came up with the infant screaming against his chest. And when he looked up at the bridge's railing, he saw her, the woman who'd jumped in after the child a second too late. Dark-skinned, curvy, gasping, eyes wide with terror, and something that cracked right through his armor. Something impossible woke up inside him. Welcome to Story World, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. The rain had been falling since dawn. Tae-yoon stood at the edge of the Hangang Bridge in a black coat that cost more than most people's monthly salary, watching the river below with the detached stillness of a man who owned every underground operation in Seoul and felt nothing about it. He came here sometimes, not to think. Men like him didn't have the luxury of unstructured thought. He came here to remind himself that the city was still beneath him, still his. His second-in-command, Shin Dae-won, waited 10 paces back beneath an umbrella, close enough to respond, far enough to disappear if ordered to. The blue bundle appeared from nowhere. One moment the bridge railing was empty. The next, something tumbled over it, small, wrapped, wailing, and hit the water with a sound that carved through the rain like a scream. Tae-yoon moved before his mind caught up. His coat hit the railing. His body followed. The water was February cold, a fist closing around his chest, but he drove downward, hands reaching, and his fingers found fabric. He surfaced with the infant clamped to his chest, his own lungs burning, just in time to see another figure hit the water 3 meters away. She came up gasping. She was fighting the current hard, her arms slicing through the water with the desperation of someone who'd learned to survive before she'd learned anything else. When she finally reached him, when she grabbed the baby with both hands and pressed her forehead to its wet face, saying words in a language that sounded like prayer and fury braided together, Tae-yoon couldn't look away. He had stood in rooms with presidents. He had walked away from men begging for their lives without blinking. He did not understand why this woman, shaking and soaking in the middle of the Han River in February, made his chest feel like something was cracking open inside it. "She's breathing," the woman gasped. "Oh God, she's breathing." The baby screamed, a beautiful, furious, alive sound. The woman looked up. Her eyes found his. Dark brown, wide, filled with the kind of relief that lived right next to collapse. She had water streaming down her face and a cut above her eyebrow, and she was the most real thing Tae-yoon had seen in 15 years. "Thank you," she said. Just that. Then she pulled the baby tighter and started swimming for shore. Later that evening, Tae-yoon sat in the private room of Seoul General Hospital wrapped in a borrowed blanket that smelled like antiseptic, refusing to leave until he knew the child was stable. Dae-won stood in the corner with the expression of a man who had long since accepted that his boss operated by rules no one else could predict. "Her name is Sophie Mensah," Dae-won said quietly, reading from his phone. 28. Nigerian. She's been in Seoul for 2 years working as a pediatric nurse at Yonsei Medical Center. The baby is her niece, 3 months old. She was bringing her across the bridge on foot because the taxi refused her in the rain and... "Is the baby stable?" "Yes." "Is she?" A pause. "She has a minor concussion from hitting the railing on her way over. She's being kept overnight for observation." Tae-yoon said nothing. He turned to the window where the city glittered like it had no idea what had just happened, and he said nothing for a very long time. "Sir," Dae-won started. "Find out what room she's in." The following morning, Sophie woke to find a vase of peonies on her hospital bedside table that had not been there the night before, a card beside it that said only, "The baby is sleeping well. CTY." She stared at it for a full minute. She had no idea who CTY was. She had no idea how peonies had appeared in a locked hospital room. She was too exhausted and too relieved about her niece Amara to think about it for more than 30 seconds before the nurse came in with breakfast. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Choi Tae-yoon had sat in the chair beside her sleeping niece's incubator for 4 hours in the middle of the night, alone, and that he had not understood why he was doing it the entire time. 3 days later, Sophie was discharged. She walked out of Seoul General into a gray Tuesday morning with Amara bundled against her chest, her bag over one shoulder, her phone already calculating how many bus transfers it would take to get home. She was halfway down the hospital steps when a black car pulled to the curb with the quiet authority of something expensive and inevitable. The window came down. Choi Tae-yoon looked at her the way people looked at things they were still deciding whether to claim. "Get in," he said. "It's cold." Sophie stopped walking. "I don't know you. You know I pulled your niece out of the river. That doesn't mean I'm getting in your car." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more interesting than a smile. "I'll drive slow," he said. "The baby looks cold." Amara chose that moment to make a small, indignant sound against Sophie's chest. Sophie looked down at her, looked back at the man in the car, looked at the gray sky, threatening more rain. "If you try anything," she said clearly, "I will scream loud enough to bring down this entire street." "I don't doubt it," he said. She got in. That afternoon, Tae-yoon's penthouse felt different with Sophie Mensah standing in it. He'd had diplomats in this space, rival bosses, women who understood exactly what kind of man he was and smiled at him anyway. None of them had stood in front of his floor-to-ceiling windows looking at Seoul like they were silently arguing with it. "Amara can stay in the guest room," he said. "There's a proper crib." Sophie turned. "Excuse me. You live in a one-bedroom in Mapo. The heating is. How do you know where I live?" The silence was its own answer. Sophie's expression sharpened. She was wearing an oversized yellow sweater and she had her arms crossed, and she looked at him like she was not remotely impressed by his penthouse or his perfectly tailored shirt or the skyline behind him. And something about that made the tension in Tae-yoon's shoulders ease for the first time in years. "You had me investigated," she said flatly. "I had you verified." "That's the same thing." "It's not. You are a stranger who looked me up without my permission. That's a violation, not a kindness." She picked up her bag and settled Amara more firmly against her. "Thank you for the ride. Thank you for jumping in after her. You saved her life, and I will never forget that. But I don't know you, and I'm going home." She walked to his door with the dignity of a woman who had survived much harder things than one uncomfortable conversation. Tae-yoon watched her go. He did not stop her. He stood at his window for a long time after the elevator closed. Then he pulled out his phone and said quietly, "Make sure someone watches her building tonight." Day-one, on the other end, said nothing. He had learned when to ask questions. This was not one of those times. A week passed. Sophie did not think about Choi Tae-yoon. She thought about him every day. She thought about the way he'd surfaced from the river with Amara on his chest, like losing her hadn't been an option. She thought about the peonies. She thought about the crib he'd mentioned, the proper crib, spoken in the tone of a man who had checked that hers wasn't adequate and found the deficiency unacceptable. She thought about the way he'd looked at her in the car, like he was solving something. She was a pediatric nurse who'd moved to Seoul alone at 26 with a nursing license, 2 suitcases, and the specific kind of stubbornness that comes from growing up as the eldest daughter of a family that needed her to survive. She did not have space in her life for complicated men. She especially did not have space for complicated men who had her verified. She was telling herself this on a Thursday evening when she walked out of Yonsei Medical Center and found him standing beside a car at the curb. Not his driver. Him, in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, watching her approach with that expression she was starting to recognize. Measuring, careful, like he was trying to be less than what he was and not quite succeeding. "I brought food," he said. "I can buy my own food." "I know you can." He held up a paper bag. "It's from the Jeonju restaurant on the corner. The one you order from 3 times a week." Sophie stopped walking. "You've been watching my food orders? I wanted to know what you liked." "That's," she searched for the word, "deeply alarming." "Also soup," he said, "in case the rain gets worse." She looked at the sky. It was already spitting. She looked at the bag. She looked at him. This large, quiet, terrifyingly attentive man who had jumped into the Han River without blinking and then apparently spent a week learning her takeout schedule. "This is not normal behavior," she said. "No," he agreed. "You know that." "Yes." "And you're doing it anyway." "Yes." Sophie exhaled. "One dinner," she said, "and then you stop monitoring my life." The corner of his mouth moved again. "Agreed," he said, and opened the car door. And Sophie got in feeling like she was walking off the edge of something and choosing not to look down. That night, they sat across from each other in the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the kind that meant both people were listening. Sophie learned that Choi Tae-yoon had grown up in Busan. That he took his coffee without sugar and his tea with a precision that suggested he'd been thinking about it for years. That he looked at Amara, sleeping in the carrier between them, with an expression he didn't know she could see, something unguarded, almost wondering. Tae-yoon learned that Sophie's laugh came out differently when she was surprised by something, shorter, brighter, like it escaped before she could contain it. That she argued about things she cared about with the focused intensity of a woman who had learned to be her own defender. That she touched the back of her neck when she was uncertain and lifted her chin when she was afraid. "Why did you really come to the bridge that morning?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her. "I went there sometimes. To think. Men who run empires don't typically jump into rivers." The sentence landed between them with everything it implied. She knew, or she'd guessed. He could see her watching his reaction, measuring the risk of what she'd said. "No," he said finally. "They don't. But you did." "I did." Sophie looked at Amara, then back at him. "I'm glad you did," she said quietly. "Whatever else you are." Tae-yoon didn't answer, but something in his expression shifted, settled, like a man who had been standing in wind for a very long time and had finally found a wall. The following week arrived with complications. The first complication was Dr. James Osei, a Ghanaian doctor newly assigned to Sophie's ward, charming and handsome and very interested in making Sophie laugh during lunch breaks. Sophie found him funny, easy to talk to, safe, in the way that uncomplicated people were safe. The second complication was that Tae-yoon found out about him on a Wednesday. He didn't mean to. Day one mentioned it in passing. The nurse was photographed leaving the hospital with a colleague, a doctor. They looked comfortable, and Tae-yoon had to very deliberately set down his pen before he bent it in half. "Define comfortable," he said. Day one wisely studied the middle distance. He was carrying her bag. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "Her bag," Tae-yoon repeated, and he touched her shoulder when she laughed. Tae-yoon stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for 45 seconds with the controlled stillness of a man performing surgery on his own reaction. Then he turned around and said, in a voice that betrayed nothing, "Cancel my afternoon. I'm going to Yonsei." He arrived at the hospital at 2 p.m. with no announcement and a box of Amara's favorite formula that Sophie had mentioned running low on. Twice, casually, in conversation, and he had written it down without meaning to and ordered it without admitting what that meant. He found Sophie in the pediatric ward hallway, mid-conversation with Dr. Osei, who was tall and easy-smiled, and standing approximately 6 inches closer to her than Tae-yoon thought was medically necessary. Sophie saw Tae-yoon first. Her expression did something complicated, surprise, warmth, followed immediately by a narrowing of eyes that meant she had already assessed his expression and was already suspicious of it. "Tae-yoon," she said. "Professional. Measured. Nurse Mensah." He crossed the distance in 5 steps. Set the box down on the nurse's station with the quiet precision of a man planting a flag. Looked at Dr. Osei. "I'm a friend of Sophie's." Osei extended a hand. "James Osei." Tae-yoon shook it. Once. The handshake of a man who was performing cordiality with surgical accuracy. "Choi Tae-yoon," he said, and watched Osei's hand go slightly still with recognition. There it was. "Sophie mentioned you saved her niece," Osei said carefully. "That was remarkable." "It was necessary," Tae-yoon said. He looked at Sophie. "I brought the formula. The brand you mentioned." Sophie looked at the box, then at him, then at the box again. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." He said it with the unhurried certainty of a man who had stopped pretending that this was casual. "Are you free at 6? Sophie blinked, glanced at Osei, glanced back. "Ah, yes. I'll be outside," Tae-yoon said, and turned and walked away before she could argue, before he could do something significantly less controlled, like removing the doctor from the general vicinity of her laugh. That evening, sitting in the car with Amara between them and the city blurring past in the dark, Sophie said, "You were rude to James." "I was polite." "You were politely rude, which is worse." Tae-yoon looked at her. "He was standing too close to you. He's my colleague. He was carrying your bag." Sophie went quiet. A different kind of quiet, the kind where she was trying not to look pleased. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window and said, "You were jealous." "I was concerned." "Tae-yoon, I was concerned," he repeated, "and I expressed it by arriving." "That's jealousy." The silence confirmed it. Sophie looked at him. really looked at him, and something in her expression softened. He was staring straight ahead with his jaw set and his hands perfectly still on his knees, and he looked like a man engaged in a war with himself that he was not entirely winning. "You could have just told me," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Told you what?" She held his gaze. "That you didn't want him near me." The air between them went very still. Tae-yoon's expression did something it almost never did. It fractured, just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath. "I don't have the right to say that," he said. "Not yet," she said. The word "yet" sat between them for the rest of the drive like a door left slightly open. 3 weeks later, Seoul's underworld cracked open. It started with a name, Park Yang-cheol, a rival boss who had been circling Tae-yoon's territory for 2 years, looking for the right pressure point. He'd found it, or thought he had, in the form of a woman with a Nigerian passport and a niece named Amara, photographs of whom had been placed on Tae-yoon's desk by day one on a Thursday morning with the accompanying intelligence that Yang-cheol's men had been watching Sophie for 11 days. Tae-yoon looked at the photographs. At Sophie outside the hospital. Sophie at the market. Sophie walking home with Amara in the carrier, laughing at something on her phone, completely unaware. He sat very still for a very long time. Then he said, "Lock her building. Move her. She won't agree," Day One said carefully. "I know. She's going to be angry. I know that too." That evening, Sophie came home from her shift to find 2 men in dark coats standing outside her building who were very politely, very firmly, not letting her in until someone made a phone call. Her phone rang 30 seconds later. "Tae-yoon," she said. Her voice was already the warning tone. "What is this?" "You're being watched," he said. "Not by me. By someone who wants to use you to get to me." The silence that followed was different from all their other silences. "For how long?" she asked. 11 days. She exhaled slowly. "You knew for how long?" "I found out this morning. And you decided the solution was to lock me out of my own building." "I decided the solution was to move you somewhere safe while I handle this." He paused. "I'm sorry. I should have come in person. I should have told you myself." Another silence. "Then, where?" "Somewhere with a proper security system and a crib for Amara." "Your penthouse." "Yes." Sophie looked at the 2 men, who were examining the wall with great interest. She looked at her building. She looked at Amara, bundled and blinking on her chest. "This is temporary," she said. "Of course. And you're telling me everything." "Tonight." "Yes. Everything, Tae-yoon. Everything," he said. "I promise." Later that night, he told her. Not everything. He would never burden her with the full weight of what he carried. But enough. The operations. The territory. The kind of enemies that existed when a man controlled what he controlled. He told it quietly, without softening. Watching her face for the moment, she would look at him differently. She listened. She asked questions with the focused directness of a woman who needed to understand the exact shape of a thing before she decided what to do about it. When he finished, she sat for a moment looking at Amara asleep in the borrowed crib. "She was in danger because of me," Sophie said. "She was in danger because of my enemies. Not because of you. There's a difference. There's a vast difference." His voice was careful, precise. "You didn't choose this. You didn't do anything except survive a river in February and refuse to get in a stranger's car until he mentioned your niece was cold." Something shifted in his expression. "Everything else was my doing. Coming back. Watching. Letting you matter." Sophie looked at him. "Is that what you call it? Letting me matter? I don't have a better word for it." "Try." He met her eyes. "I think about you constantly. I rearranged my schedule to drive past your hospital. I memorized your takeout orders like they were intelligence reports. When that doctor touched your shoulder, I felt something I haven't felt in 15 years, and I have no framework for any of it." He paused. "I let you matter." "Yes, that's the most accurate thing I've said in a long time." The room was very quiet. Sophie looked at him for a long moment with that expression, the one that saw through all of it, through the coat and the reputation and the controlled stillness, all the way to whatever was underneath. "Tae-yoon," she said softly. "I know," he said. "I know what I am." "That's not what I was going to say." He waited. "I was going to say I think about you too," she said. "And I've been pretending not to since the river." What happened next happened the way impossible things happen, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small moments. His hand finding hers in the kitchen when she couldn't reach something. The way he stood closer than necessary when she spoke, like proximity was a language they were both quietly learning. The evening she fell asleep on the penthouse sofa with Amara on her chest, and woke to find a blanket settled over both of them, and the lights turned low and Tae-yoon at his desk nearby, working, steady, present. There was an evening when the rain came back and the power flickered and they ended up standing in the kitchen in the dark, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And when the lights came back on, neither of them moved, and he looked down at her with an expression she felt like gravity. "Sophie," he said, just her name, like a decision. She reached up. He met her halfway. What followed was quiet and unhurried and full of the specific tenderness of two people who had been resisting something they had no business resisting. The city disappeared. The rain disappeared. The penthouse faded to the edges. When Sophie surfaced, hours later, she was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The fear arrived at 3 a.m. She lay in the dark listening to his breathing beside her and felt the familiar cold flood of this was a mistake. This was too much. He will realize it tomorrow and look at you differently. She had been here before. Not with him. With the version of herself that had learned too early that warmth was temporary and men like this one, powerful, certain, terrifying in their intensity, always eventually found something more suitable. She got up carefully, quietly, dressed in the dark. She was almost to the door when his voice came from behind her. "Don't." She froze. She heard him move, felt him before she saw him, his presence filling the space behind her, not surrounding her, not blocking her, just there. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly. "You don't. You think I'll wake up and see you differently." His voice was steady, no accusation in it. "You think last night changes how I see you into something smaller." She didn't answer. "Sophie." He came around to face her. She kept her eyes down. He didn't force her to look up. He waited. That patience, that terrible, careful patience that undid her more than anything else. "Look at me." She looked up. His face in the dark was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "Last night didn't change how I see you," he said. "It confirmed everything I've been trying to find words for since February." He reached up, slowly, the way he always moved when he touched her, like she was something he'd been trusted with, and curved his hand against her jaw. "You are not something I will wake up and reconsider. You are the one thing I have been certain of since I saw you in the river, fighting for someone who needed you, refusing to drown." Sophie's throat tightened. "Stay," he said. "Not because you have nowhere to go, because I am asking you to." She pressed her forehead to his chest, felt his arms come around her, firm and warm and absolute. She stayed. The danger came on a Friday. Tae-yoon was in a meeting when Day One entered without knocking, which hadn't happened in 9 years. The expression on his face was enough. "Yang Cheol's men took her," Day One said. "Outside the hospital. They have Amara too." The room went very quiet. Tae-yoon stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not throw anything. He simply looked at Day One with an expression that made every man in the room take one involuntary step backward. "Tell me where," he said. The warehouse in Incheon smelled like salt water and metal. Sophie sat in a chair with Amara held tight against her chest, the baby mercifully asleep despite everything, and she breathed the way she'd learned to breathe in crisis, slow, controlled, from the bottom of the lungs. She was afraid. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even inside her own head. But she was also furious. Park Yang-cheol sat across from her with the studied ease of a man who believed that comfort was power. He was older, gray at the temples, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Choi Tae-yoon will come," he said pleasantly. "And when he does, the negotiation will be much simpler with you in the room." "Using a baby as leverage," Sophie said. "You're proud of that?" Yang-cheol tilted his head. "You have a very high opinion of your own position for someone who is currently my guest." "I'm a pediatric nurse," Sophie said flatly. "I have been in more crisis situations than you have. I have held dying children and walked children back from edges you cannot imagine. You and your warehouse don't frighten me as much as you'd like them to." Yang-cheol blinked. "If you hurt her," Sophie said, looking at him steadily, "there is no deal you make tonight that will save you. Because the man coming for me? He's not coming to negotiate." Tae-yoon arrived in 40 minutes. He came with 12 men and ended it in 11. The details were not cinematic. They were precise and overwhelming and total, the way Tae-yoon did everything. Yang Cheol's operation dismantled. His men dispersed. His leverage dissolved. The door to the back room opened. Sophie looked up. Tae-yoon crossed the room in 4 steps, dropped to one knee in front of her, and checked her face, her arms, her hands, with a systematic and focused attention that was more terrifying in its gentleness than anything Yang Cheol had said. "Are you hurt?" "No, Amara. She's fine. She slept through most of it." Sophie's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. She'd been holding them still for hours. "I told you. Your enemies aren't that frightening." Something cracked across Tae-yoon's face. Something that bypassed control completely and landed raw and open and real. He pulled her forward with one arm and held her, both of them, Sophie and Amara together, and pressed his face into her hair and said nothing for a very long time. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "This will never happen again." "You can't promise that." "I'm promising it anyway." Sophie didn't argue. She tucked her face against his shoulder and let herself feel it. The relief, the terror that was finally allowed to arrive now that it was over, and underneath all of it, the certainty of him. Steady, present, absolute. A month later, Park Yang-cheol's organization was finished. Not dramatically, not with fire, with the quiet, comprehensive thoroughness of a man who had decided something was going to end and then simply made it end. Tae-yoon dismantled it with the same precision he applied to everything he decided mattered. Sophie watched the city change from the penthouse windows and thought about what it meant to choose a life that was this complicated. Then she thought about February. About a man she didn't know hitting the river without blinking. About peonies on a hospital nightstand and a crib that had appeared without being asked for and a hand finding hers in the kitchen dark. She thought about choosing. 3 months after the river, Tae-yoon came home to find Sophie at the penthouse kitchen counter, Amara in her high chair, both of them involved in a very serious discussion about mashed sweet potato. Sophie's hair was loose. She was wearing his oversized gray sweater and didn't know she was doing it, which meant she'd been wearing it all day. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. He'd run empires. He'd managed crises that would have broken lesser men. He had never been more certain of anything in his life than he was of this. This ordinary, warm, impossible scene. He crossed the kitchen, set down his jacket, put his hands on Sophie's shoulders from behind, and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You're wearing my sweater," he said. "It's comfortable," she said, without looking up from Amara's bowl. "You can keep it." "I know I can." He turned her gently, tipped her face up. She looked at him with those eyes, steady, bright, still the most real thing he'd ever seen. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You're never actually nervous," she said. "But you look nervous." "I'm asking anyway." He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a ring, not enormous, not performative. A solitaire set simply, with the clean precision of a man who had learned that she preferred honest things to impressive ones. "Sophie Mensah, I am asking you to stay. Not temporarily. Not until the next thing. Permanently." He held her gaze. "I jumped into the river for you before I knew who you were. I would burn down the city to keep you now. I want that choice to mean something legal and real and permanent." Sophie looked at the ring. At him. At Amara, who had sweet potato on her forehead and was watching them both with profound baby seriousness. "You're sure?" she said. "I have never been more sure of anything." She smiled. Not the polite smile, not the controlled smile, the one that escaped before she could contain it. Bright and sudden and wholly hers. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He put the ring on her finger, pulled her in. She pressed her face against his chest and laughed. That surprised laugh. And Amara banged her spoon on the tray, and the city glittered beyond the glass, and Tae-yoon held on like someone who had been drowning for 15 years and had finally found shore. 1 year later, Sophie stood in the window of their bedroom in the late evening light with her hand pressed flat against the small curve of her stomach. 8 weeks along, confirmed that morning, and thought about rivers and impossible things and the specific bravery of letting yourself be saved. Behind her, she heard Tae-yoon come in from the hallway. Felt him stop. "Sophie," he said quietly. She turned. He was looking at her hand against her stomach, at her face, the expression that crossed his. The man who had never once in 15 years let the armor slip was complete and total and devastating in its openness. He crossed the room, knelt in front of her, put his hands over hers, both of them, over the tiny impossible life they'd made between them. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were bright. "Tell me everything," he said, the way she had said it to him once, a year ago, in a borrowed penthouse with an enemy circling. Don't leave anything out. Sophie laughed, pressed her forehead to his. We have time, she said. We have so much time. And they did. The Ice King had jumped into a river for a stranger. The stranger had refused his car and his certainty and his terrifying attentiveness right up until she couldn't anymore. And somewhere in the space between February cold water and an August evening with a ring on her finger and a life beginning, they had built something neither of them had known how to name. They had built home. Some people find each other in ordinary ways. Some find each other in rivers. Both kinds of love are real. Only one of them knows, from the very first moment, that it will never let go. See you on the next one. Have a good day.